afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the great conference of the Institute of Advanced Transdisciplinary Studies at UFMG. This event is part of the Fundep IEAT Chair Program, which brings leading international scholars to engage with our academic community. Today's lecture marks a special occasion as we host Professor Christian Schmid from the Federal Institute of Technology in Zuriche, whose work has inspired profound reflection on the epistemology of the urban. We are deeply grateful for his presence at our institute and for sharing his insights with us today. I would like to take a moment to thank and welcome Professor Heloísa Soares Moura Costa from the Institute of Ciências, who will moderate the debate following the lecture. Professor Heloísa is also a long-standing collaborator of IEAT, having served for years as member of the Institute's steering committee, and her contributions have been invaluable to our mission. Thank you, Professor Heloísa. I would like to highlight and thank the Cosmopolis group, currently host at IEAT. Over the past years, Cosmopolis has developed innovative transdisciplinary approach to studying the urban, connecting architecture, geography, arts, politics, and traditional knowledge in truly creative ways. A special knowledge goes to Professor Rita Veloso, coordinator of Cosmopolis, whose vision and commitment have been essential to the group's development. Although she could not be with us today, as she is currently at a senior fellowship at the Zukunftskolleg Institute for Advanced Studies, our partner institute at the University of Constance, we recognize her contribution. Professor Rita, together with several professors present here, Professor João Tonucci, Heloísa, Geraldo, Tiago, Professor Estevão, and several others professors are also partners in IEAT in the project to establish a long-term chair in cities and urban studies at our institute. May thanks also go to Professor João Tonucci and Tiago Canettieri for being the hosts of the Professor Christian Schmid during his visit, for their valuable partnership with IEAT in organizing this great conference, and for their many other collaborative initiatives with Professor Schmid's chair. On behalf of the IEAT, I warmly welcome all of you and wish us an inspiring afternoon of dialogue and reflection. Now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Professor João Tonucci, who will introduce our distinguished guest, Professor Christian Schmid. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Patrícia. Boa tarde, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for all of you for being here. On behalf of the Center for Development and Regional Planning, CEDEPLAR, and the Faculty of Economic Sciences, we would like to warmly welcome Professor Christian Schmid. I would also like to thank IEAT, especially Professor Patrícia and the wonderful staff and team for making his visit possible here at the UFMG, and Professors Tiago Canettieri and Rita Veloso from Cosmopolis Group for their help in organizing this series of events. And finally, my thanks to all members of the Cátedras Cidade, a recently established long-term chair program at the IEAT, particular Professors Roberto Montemor, Geraldo Costa, and Heloísa Soares de Moura Costa, and we have the pleasure of having her today as our discussant. So before giving Christian the floor, I'd like to quickly introduce him. Professor Christian Schmid is a geographer, an urban researcher. He's Professor Emeritus of Sociology at the Department of Architecture of the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, IEAT, Zurich. His work focuses on planetary urbanization, comparative urban analysis, and theories of urbanization and space. Professor Schmid has been indirectly collaborating with members from UFMG for quite some years now, but this is the first time we have the privilege of having him here and hosting him for this extended stay for almost a little bit longer than 2 months here with us. So alongside the program of public seminars and lectures, such as this one, we have organized a series of research meetings, field visits, and reading sessions with his support. So anyone who's interested in joining afterwards or integrating this different kind of activities, please let us know. And this aligns very well with the Cátedra Cidade's mission to foster a transdisciplinary, campus-wide environment for research on urban studies and planning at UFMG, and also strengthening the universities through international dialogue and collaboration. So without further ado, I'd like to please invite Professor Schmid to deliver his talk today, and thanking him in advance for what I'm sure will be a very inspiring and interesting discussion afterwards. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much to you all for this nice introduction.
Christian, if you could please use it.
Yes.
And I think we will...
No. After that, I will
I
stand.
think we will leave you here so we can watch
Okay.
it from there.
Okay. Yes. Fine. Okay. So thank you very much for this introduction, and also, of course, for the invitation. I have a great time here in Belo Horizonte, and it's really amazing for me to see this very specific type of urbanization. And I will learn more. We already saw quite a bit on different trips here, and I will even learn more about it. And I already announced then the next talk I will give on extended urbanization, and of course that's a topic that fits perfectly well into this region. So here it's a great pleasure really to also to see the culture, and to see also I think this kind of intellectual culture, which is I think is really fantastic. And it's I mean, it's really a pity for years and years and years these important Latin American contributions to urban studies, to urbanization, to center-periphery developments, the whole dependencia theory that was so important in the 1970s. And I'm still coming out of the 1970s, and I still, when I was a student, we read this debate. And then it somehow disappeared almost completely. Articles and books were not translated anymore for decades. And only in the last five, even not 10, I would say the last 5 years, it is a kind of a revival. And we get more information, we get more translations of these important works. And it's for me a great pleasure to be in direct contact in discussion with scholars from this great tradition. So, and I just start, I think it fits well with this. So, and I think that's, I mean, just to see such a book unfortunately, I can't read it. I mean, I can understand more or less the titles, but then I have to stop. But it was just amazing for me to see that such a book, as a result of a university, all from the same university. It's not a kind of international cooperation. No, it is a cooperation in that one university. I think it's amazing. It's an amazing achievement. And I think it's, I mean, that the titles were just great. And I would be very curious to read more about those texts that are assembled in this book. Now, yes. So my topic today, of course, is about urbanization. It's about the urbanization of the planet. And that's the topic that we were working about since, well, if I say we, with my friends at the beginning as students, later on with my collaborators, later on with my own students and my teams. So we were working since a long time on this question of urbanization. And at the beginning, it was a small kind of place. It was the urbanization of Zurique and then the urbanization of Switzerland. Finally, we turned to the urbanization of the planet. And it is really the moment to really discuss that, because so if I look back over the last 40 years, when I followed all the new series, all the new researches that have been done, it's really a different urban world today than it was only 40 years ago. It's really amazing. The world of the 1970s and the 1980s, they are really in a different century. It really feels like that. And these changes in urbanization in the entire world were really dramatic. So we could even say, you probably, I mean, I learned that there are a lot of Lefebvre scholars here. So I will not just introduce you anymore into this theory. So you might even understand the term critical zone. I will just come back to that. What is the critical zone? The critical zone is, according to Lefebvre, when the urbanization process arrives slowly 100%. And I think in that zone, we are really today in that zone. When I was reading for the first time Lefebvre in the early 1980s as a student, for us it was still, oh yes, that's a perspective. That's, yes, how will it look like? Now, 40 years later, it is reality. And that's not a nice reality. It's a very shocking reality. And I even don't start to go through all the processes, but we can say that the urbanization was never as massive and never as rapid as in the last 40 years. And it is a highly unequal process. It's much more unequal than it used to be, for instance, in the post-war period. And it is not only a process of, let's say, the extension of urban territories, but it's also a process that is going through the entire world with a migration process, massive migration processes in all directions. It's also a process, a lot of refugees, I don't have to tell you, you know that. And the result of all these different forms of urbanization is, at the end, if you drive through these urbanizing territories, we can say that it is a very fragmented and a very polarized and a very contradictory experience. So the experience driving through territories of planetary urbanization in our times here, in in the 2020s is a trip that sometimes looks like a nightmare, but it is also a trip where you never know what will happen at the next corner. What will you see if you drive further on? And you drive through these territories not for half an hour, not for an hour. You drive for hours through urbanizing territories. And with, of course, sometimes really devastating results. And of course, the end of that story, and this is also, of course, a reality we live in, are then all the ecological crises. To mention only the ecological crisis, not the social, political crisis and the wars we live in, but just from the ecological point of view, and that's a dramatic, I would say, development in the last years. It's an escalation. And we see no end of global heating. We see no end of the destruction of biodiversity in all our landscapes. And we see a looming food crisis because, of course, with heating and with this massive biodiversity loss, we are already in the midst of that. There is also a decline of agricultural yields. Okay, so, and that has all to do strongly with urbanization. So, well, a little bit of Henri Lefebvre, nevertheless. I think that, and that was also one of my works. So already as a student, as I already told you, we work together, actually collectively as students, with his series. We read his book, The Urban Revolution, which was translated into German at the time. And if we go through his most important works on that question, what we realize is, I mean, in a very short period, no, these are 6 years. 1968, he published Le droit à la ville. So what is the key term here? okay, the right, but la ville, okay, so the city. Then 2 years later, he published The Urban Revolution. And the first sentence of that book is, I would like to start with a hypothesis, the hypothesis of the complete urbanization of society. And it's a hypothesis, he says, it is it's a tendency towards the complete urbanization. It's not reached today, but it's a horizon. And that's what I meant. We reached that horizon. And already at that moment, in these 2 years, despite the fact that his book became a very important book, The Ride to the City, and started to motivate movements, and I don't have to tell you, it's in the Brazilian constitution, so you know that all very well. So despite the fact that this became an important book, 2 years later, he says, well, forget about the city. The city is, sociology speaking, from the perspective of sociology, it's a pseudo concept. It's not a concept we can use anymore because we are living in a world that is rapidly urbanizing, and so we have to focus on the process, and the process is the process of urbanization, and the city is a kind of it's somehow, if it still exists, it's a kind of, these are remnants of the past. These are kind of, yes, we could say they still exist, but at the end, they are blurring, they are exploding, they are imploding. You know the famous kind of sentence: implosion, explosion, that's urbanization. At the same time, massive concentration in the center and massive extension in the peripheries, and that's the urbanization process. And in that process, the city as a form, the city as also as a kind of a unity, social or political unity, is exploding, is destroyed in that process. Together, he says, or he said, together with the countryside. So here we are in a different world, already 2 years later. And then another 4 years later, he even don't talk anymore about the city or the urbanization process. No, he talks about space. And that book, The Production of Space, at the time, while his first books were really read, they were translated. I know that activists used those books. They read it, they made use of it. But then when he published The Production of Space, La Production de l'Espace, it was even not translated in almost no language for a long time. And so it passed almost unnoticed. Nobody understood the kind of huge step that Lefebvre did in that book. So suddenly, and that's I think the key change here. So the urban as a city, as a bounded unit, as something you can still contain, something that you can still somehow try to manage, towards a process that is almost uncontrollable, a process that is, of course, in time and space, that is continually changing our landscapes. How can we really find, let's say, analytical tools, analytical ways of analyzing these processes? And here he even came up and said, okay, we have to understand how space is produced. At the time, it made almost no sense. Space is produced, space is here. No, we know what space is a given. And he said, no, it's not a given, it's something that is produced. So I stop here because that would be another lecture, and I gave already a lecture on that some 2 weeks ago. But it's just very important to see that suddenly the kind of the terrain shifts. You don't talk about anymore about cities, you even only partly talk about urbanization, but you talk about the urbanization of space. And you have to talk about, so you see the entire territory of the surface of the earth that is affected by urbanization, and how to grasp that analytically. That was the big challenge. So we could say it needs a kind of an epistemological reorientation. And this was something that then at a certain moment Neil Brenner and I started to discuss and to develop for some years, published then in 2015. And it has some consequences. So the idea of a process that becomes planetary, a process that is somehow affecting the entirety of space or the entirety of the surface of the planet. It has important theoretical consequences, and of course also methodological consequences. So first of all, can we see the urban? That was the first question. Can we see the urban? The answer was no, we can't see the urban. The urban is a concept. So we have first to define what it is. We cannot go there and say, okay, like into a forest, and what kind of species do I find there? No, it is in itself the question of how you define the urban or even urbanization. And then, of course, again, the next point, is it bounded? Is it an object, the city as an object, or is it the process? Is it monodimensional? Can we just say, okay, the urbanization is just the growth of cities, or urbanization is just agglomeration, or is it multidimensional? Is it a universal process? And some scientists, they still insist. No, they say urbanization started actually 3000 before Christ, or even earlier in Babylon and those Mesopotamian cities. And it's the same thing until today. Or no, on the contrary, urbanization is something very specific, and urban spaces are always specific. What happens with the rural? Can we still talk about the urban-rural or rural-urban contradiction? Or happened something with that contradiction in the meantime? What is with center and peripheries? How did they develop? Is the idea that the city is the center and the rural is the periphery? If you look today empirically, that's not true anymore, at least partly. And then, of course, is urbanization just a process of concentration and agglomeration, or is it also a process of extension? So then we have first to define what urbanization is. So as I told you, we can't see it. We have to define it. It is a concept. And that's often also not understood. And I start here with Ildefons Cerdà, who so the Catalan architect and urban designer who built. He was the designer of the designer of Barcelona. No, this classic grid, and he somehow labeled the term urbanisation that didn't exist before. So it's a neologism. So it's not something, oh, it's obvious, urbanization, it was ever there. No, it was not there. It was Cerdà, he, at the very moment when he saw his Barcelona exploding through the industrialization process, he defined a process that he called urbanisation. And then it was quite quickly translated, urbanisation, urbanization, and so on. So it's something that an architect somehow invented, no? So it already shows how theory is built. He did not just see it, he saw something, he saw an urban explosion, but then he, at the same time, also understood it as a kind of a concept for design, no? How you design urbanization. Okay, and then we can go on, and of course, then we have Henri Lefebvre, and then, and that's, yes, of course, we have Milton Santos, we have Annibal Quijano, of course, we have David Harvey, but you see that the contributions in the 1960s and 1970s from Latin America were important. And now, very briefly, so what is, how could we define it today? I mean, this is, again, just a proposal. It's a theory. If you follow Lefebvre's famous triadic thinking, so conceived space, perceived space, lived space, I explained that the last time, so I will not explain it again. But we could say that urbanization, if we follow Lefebvre, is always, I mean, we could of course define it also in different ways. But we could say it is a spatial practice. Lefebvre calls that a spatial practice. And we could say this is the material process of production, or the process of material production of space. So not only the built environment. So our bodies are part of that process. So if we go through a meadow, and then the result is a path, that's already the first step of the production of space. At the same time, it is related to the production of knowledge, of conceived space, of the representation of space. Something that we do at universities as geographers, as planners, as architects, as economists. So we develop theories and concepts about space. Of course, planning is part of it. And in the wide sense, it has to do with what we call territorial regulation. And that includes not only the official regulations, let's say the ordinances and the plans and stuff, it also, let's say the implicit even, not only the informal rules, but the implicit rules that govern the way how we use a territory. So it's a very general kind of understanding. And these are key elements of urbanization. And then, of course, it's also, and that's Lefebvre, and that's the reason why I'm really so fascinated by theory. Lived space, space is not something we can see, space is not something that we can conceive, but space is also something we experience. And that's, I think, a key moment. Not many theories have that. And that's also, of course, the relationship with everyday life. So we all do that in our everyday life. So it's not something abstract, it's something very concrete. And that's the process of the production of meaning. So we could say there is three-dimensional process that we could define as urbanization process. And then a term that created a lot of discussions and controversies. Well, planetary urbanization, that was then how Neil Brenner and I labeled our texts. There was also Andy Murrayfield. At the same time, somehow independently came to a similar point, which is not so astonishing because it anyways goes back to Lefebvre. But what did we mean with that term? So the starting point was looking on our experiences that we could do in our empirical research, particularly in our own teams and my teams. We realized there is an urbanization process. There's a planetary reach of that process. And Edward Zoja once said, in one of his last articles, he said, well, he said almost every square meter of the world is affected by urbanization in one or the other way. And I think he was right. And that means we have to change our perspective. So we have to take on a planetary perspective. But what does that mean? It does not mean to go to the moon and then look down to the Earth. It means we have to look we have to decentering our kind of our view on these processes. So we could position ourselves in every point of the planet and somehow look what kind of urbanization processes are somehow affecting that piece of territory. And that's quite, and that's no accident. It's something that is quite strongly related with what Jennifer Robinson called ordinary cities. Of course, we couldn't use the term cities anymore. Okay, we could say ordinary urban territories. So Jennifer Robinson's kind of call in her book was, so every city should become a place for theory building and research. It's not only and that was a massive critique on the time still at the beginning of the 2000s, of the state of urban research, where you had some famous cities. Everybody knows them. They are all European and North American, and that was and all the rest was a kind of deviation. So, you want to study Kolkata? Well, this is a deviation. No? Maybe you look better, I don't know, Paris. We can give you a great help. And that was actually an experience by Ananya Roy, who made her PhD with some of the most famous urban researchers of the time. And she was studying Kolkata, and they couldn't help her anymore because it didn't fit. And Jennifer Robinson, of course, South Africa, the similar experience. Studied Durban, the place where she grew up, and who can help us to understand Durban? well, nobody, because nobody was interested in that. So that changed, and that was, of course, the post-colonial change in the perspective of urban studies. And we just want to go one step further and say it's not only to go to Africa or to India, but it's also to go to all different kinds of territories that are usually not seen as urban. So we then came up with a concept of concentrated, extended, and differential urbanization. And very briefly, probably you know all that, but just as a kind of a reminder. So concentrated urbanization. This is the usual way how to look at urbanization. Still officially, if you have UN reports, if you have any kind of planning texts, it's always they always talk about regions, no? Cities and regions, and urban regions and metropolitan regions and agglomerations. And that's somehow the imaginary of that. So the world as a collection, so these are, at the time, it would still look similar today. It didn't change much, actually, from 2008. If you look on that, what you see is, these are the biggest, let's say, urban regions of the world. All of them have more than 1 million inhabitants officially, and that is the pattern that you have. And some of them are mega cities with more than 10 million, and that's the urban world. And well, we thought, what we see is something else. And what do we see? I'll just come back to that briefly about the concentrated urbanization. So the idea behind that is the so-called power of agglomeration, which is actually a term that comes from the German, the Agglomerationskraft, by Alfred Weber. So Alfred Weber was the brother of Max Weber, the sociologist, and he developed that idea of agglomeration. So the idea behind that, if there are a lot of central functions, factories, a concentration of people, concentration of means of production, concentration of capital, concentration of knowledge, concentration of all different kind of uses, they have a specific force, and that force is that they attract more uses and more people and more capital and more jobs. So, well, yes, it is something that works to a certain degree, with some limits. So the result of that is then urban regions and mega-regions. And what happened in the last, I would say, 40 years, citadels of global economy, there was this global city idea, this world city idea. What went hand in hand was an urban triumphalism. So, famous book by Glaser, the economist, The Triumph of the City. So, yes, so the triumph of the city. And what is with the rest? So all these poor people who are not in the city, who don't have the luck that they are in the city. They are in the non-urban. And then also these lucky people that are in the city, that are in the citadels of global economy, and they are confronted with the commodification of the urban. So the urban becomes a commodity. And the result of that is everything has to be part of, so everything in a city becomes a kind of something that is sold and bought. So the result is housing becomes a commodity. So we live in a time of permanent housing crisis, of displacement and everything that goes with it. We live in these metropolitan areas. They are massively unequal. There are processes of peripherization that we also studied in even the core of those metropolises. there is a crisis of social reproduction, and of course there's a climate crisis in the double sense of the world. So, on the one hand, this kind of development leads to a climate crisis, or leads to the climate crisis. But also the climate crisis is now, we can feel it in our metropolitan centers. No. So the heat, so we have a heat crisis actually. And there is another picture of urbanization, of planetary urbanization. And it's this one that was for us at the very beginning always very, well, so somehow we were immediately, it was telling. It was a telling picture. So the global shipping lanes, so all the container boats and oil tankers that cross the 7 seas, and with all sorts of here, for instance, kind of traffic jams, or here. So this is Street of Singapore and Malacca, and this is the Suez Canal. Yeah, so that's of course also urbanization, but it's in a certain way not seen as to having to do anything with urbanization. Now, here we use the term extended urbanization that we somehow developed and found out then that there is already Roberto Montibor who has already written about that, even an entire PhD about Amazonia. And we have the same sources, Lefebvre, so I think our definitions are quite similar. So there is a metabolic restriction. A city cannot feed its people, and that was the reason for hundreds and thousands of years cities were small. Between 10, even a city, I mean a real city, had between 10,000 to 30,000 inhabitants, almost independently where they were, because they needed the hinterland to feed the city. And that changed only with industrialization. So at the moment when this metabolic restriction fell down through the process of industrialization and, of course, transportation with steamboats and trains, then suddenly a whole different way of urbanization became possible. And so these are all the regions that are beyond urban and metropolitan regions. They are somehow also beyond the limits of the urban, and they somehow drive heavily into the so-called or former rural areas. And we have to be clear, the metabolic restriction tells us that there is no concentrated urbanization possible without bringing food and water and raw materials and fuel into these agglomerations. So, and if you look on those places where these products are produced, this is also a kind of urbanization processes that are going on. And that's somehow the key aspect here. So this kind of forgotten part, urbanization, is just big cities, and the rest, you can forget it. So, and that rest is the real battle zone. These are places of enclosure, of dispossession, of eviction, of degradation, of pollution, and of course, they are also key elements of the current crisis, and not only of the climate crisis, but here we have the massive loss of biodiversity, we have the massive, that's something that then soon become maybe also a food crisis, as I said at the beginning. So here, so here it's, we could say, the other side of urbanization. And then we said, well, there is something else, there's something more, because the horrors of the metropolises and the horrors of the battle zone beyond the metropolises, that's not a good starting point. So there is, of course, also the qualities of the urban. There's always a chance, and this is again a lesson that Lefebvre gave us. There is a chance urbanization can also be productive. And I don't go into the details here. There is, of course, the question of there are kind of contradictions. And the first contradiction is the contradiction between center and periphery. And the urban can be a place of centrality. If it works, centrality for everybody. That's the point. Right to the city here means, first of all, right to centrality. Everybody should be able, everybody of a society should be able to also participate on that qualities of centrality. And then difference. The battle between differentiation and homogenization. Urbanization as a homogenizing force, but at the same time, it could also become a force that differentiates. That because there are a lot of, because of immigration, but also of the great variety of people living in urban places, there is a chance that differences are developing, and so it could also become a place of difference. And then there's also the chance that urban areas could become places of mediation, places of inclusion, instead of exclusion, what we see today, in which we think it's almost a normal thing going on that we see in our neoliberalized cities. But there is always the chance to bring people together in these urban regions and beyond. And so we have a kind of a grid, or we have some ideas about what could be the positive side of urbanization. It could be centrality, production of centrality, production of difference, and production of mediation for the entire population. And of course, at the end, it's use value versus exchange value. So now I come to the point of the concept of urbanization processes. So if we have difficulties to define what is a city, what is an urban territory, what is concentrated, what is extended urbanization. So one of the key, let's say, empirical instruments, or theoretical instruments to guide our empirical analysis is the concept of urbanization processes. So instead of looking on entire territories and say, okay, this is, so where is the border of that territory, where is the border of the urban, and what is beyond the urban, we could also say what kind of processes are really developing on a territory. And we started in our analysis with a critique of the established concepts of urbanization processes. And we realized that we don't have many. Everybody knows suburbanization, everybody knows gentrification, of course, urban informality. And if that is the entire, let's say, vocabulary we have at hand to describe what's going on, we have a real problem. And we have some more here, post-suburbanization, peri-urbanization, urban redevelopment, urban renewal, but they are all more or less in the same register. So the first thing we did was, and that's the first project finished, and that book you can download. It's open access, so for free, so just check it. And that was the project Patterns and Pathways of Urbanization, a comparative analysis. And we worked at the end about 10 years on that project. It was based at the Future Cities Laboratory in Singapore. And Patterns and Pathways also says, and I wrote that already in my last talk, you make on the one hand a horizontal analysis that tries to understand the present situation, the different urbanization processes that you can detect on the territory, and the vertical analysis, diachronic analysis, to understand the production process of that urbanization process. Very briefly, what did we do? I could form a team with basically PhD students, one postdoc. And what we did, we started with fieldwork, with mobile and multi-sited research on their different territories. And then we developed the method of collective mapping. So to understand how these territories are urbanized. And what I didn't say is, for this project, we looked at some of the largest metropolitan territories we had. So it's Tokyo, it's half of the Pearl River Delta, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Dongguan, it's Lagos, it's Kolkata, and Paris, and Los Angeles, and Mexico City. So, and to get some ideas about these territories, we started with a kind of, you could say, a qualitative interviews or qualitative mapping approach. And then we identified different urban configurations, and that is already a first kind of comparative moment. So you have your territory, let's say of Tokyo, you look at Tokyo, can we see differences in that territory on a qualitative level? So we didn't make a factorial analysis of things. We didn't use, in most of the cases, it was almost hopeless to use any kind of statistics. I mean, just take the example of Lagos. In Lagos, at the time, how many inhabitants has Lagos? And it was unclear. So the state, the national state, said 9 million. So Lagos province said 18 billion. And the UN somehow compromised 15 billions. Okay, so how can we use any kind of quantitative data when we even don't know how many people live in this area? So any kind of calculations are completely hopeless under those conditions. So, so we started really with qualitative analysis. And the first thing is somehow map this territory. And that's now the working maps that we produced. And that's Mexico City. And you start with colors. So somehow, let's say the rule was you can have 10 colors, you can have more, you can use less if you like. But at the end of the day, you come back to the meetings and you need more or less the entire sheet full of these colors, and then you have to discuss. We discuss. You have to explain us what is the green and what is the blue and what is the red and so on. So and in doing that, you see already a first figure emerging, very, very unclear at the beginning, and then maybe you work further. You make, of course, interviews. You really travel the territory. You use all the sources that you can, of course, also statistics if they are available. And at the end, you start to consolidate your map. And so this is Istanbul. This is Kolkata. So you see, so every researcher did their own maps, and so we had a first level of analysis, and then we conceptualized that in many workshops. So we came all together, and then we said, okay, can we see any kind of parallels? So what is this blue in Kolkata? Has this something to do with the red or the green in Mexico City? Are there parallels? So we went through discussing in the pure, let's say, synthesis meetings that went on usually for a week, 10 days. And we did that every half a year for about 5 years. So we discussed probably about 3 to 4 months in total, all together, the entire team. Okay, and now I go quickly through and then I go into more details. Just that you see how different the results are. So this is Tokyo. And I don't start now to explain it. I will explain the colors after that. This is half of the Pearl River Delta. So here is, that's Hong Kong. That's Hong Kong actually, and the hinterland. And that's Dongguan, and that's Shenzhen, and that's Dongguan. And then there's also Guangzhou, but that was too much. That's Kolkata, that's Lagos, Istanbul, Mexico City, Paris, and Los Angeles. So you see, they look very different. But now the colors have some meaning. And here so here we started to develop different kind of urbanization processes. And we came up with a new list of processes that were the result of our comparison: popular urbanization, plotting urbanism, mass housing urbanization, bypass urbanization, and so on. And I will now explain some of them. And the first, probably most interesting for you, in Brazil and Latin America, so the question of urban informality. And I can't go into the details here, but that was at the beginning already something that we were confronted with: urban informality, and it's all the same. It's informal. And that tells everything. Everyone has an idea, and of course, informal territories are usually slums, and they are horrible, and so this kind of they have to be demolished. They have to be, or at least upgraded, and so that was the narrative at the time: slum clearance, and get rid of this informality because it's bad. Nobody told us why it's bad, but it's bad. So the planners thought they have to get rid of it. So a closer look gives a very different picture. And you know that. I mean, I know where I am here. So you know that this kind of Western kind of imaginaries, what that is. And so we already started with a term that we found actually in Mexico City. Popular urbanization, urbanización popular, and you also have terms for that. I know it here in Brazil and in many other, of course, in many other countries. So a much more, let's say, a term that takes that process seriously, that sees in these places their qualities, and that sees a process. Maybe at the beginning it's just some makeshift huts. And then maybe at the end, these are entire neighborhoods. And these neighborhoods are constructed by their people. So that's a huge difference. We compared that with mass housing urbanization in Paris and mass housing urbanization in Hong Kong and other places. And then at a certain moment, we thought, well, maybe it's much better to live at the end of the process, not at the beginning, in a so-called informal settlement in Istanbul or in Mexico City, than to live in a trap like in the banlieue of Paris. It's state-built houses, and they have good qualities, but at the same time are also lots full of problems. So here, that was the starting point, popular urbanization. And then a second process that is also linked to informality, which is plotting urbanism. And so here we just compared, well, this is Mexico City, this is Istanbul, and this is Lagos. And in the case of Mexico City, that was the most astonishing one. That's Nezahualcóyotl. 2 million inhabitants. It was seen as the urban apocalypse in the media in the 1980s. And if you go through this neighborhood today, it is a neighborhood. It is really a neighborhood, and it has a lot of qualities. And it's self-built. It's almost completely self-built by the people themselves, so they can also change it. It has a lot of qualities, and it has a lot of chances. You can add something. You have different needs, and so you can adapt it. Similar process in Istanbul. These were the gecekondu, and gecekondu means built overnight. So it was a law in the constitution that if you have a piece of land and you build a hut and you stay overnight, then you can stay there. I mean, it's much more complicated, of course. And this is Lagos. Now, we will see how that goes on, because there is a second process that we found very similar. And we call that plotting urbanism. And the inspiration was Lagos. In Lagos, it's a very different process. It's I can't go into the details, but the land is somehow it is somebody buys a piece of land, but it's difficult to buy a piece of land in Lagos because it's a double rule. It's the rule of the state, modern rule, and it's traditional rule. Customary rights are also on the land, so you have to get somehow that land, and then you can construct something, plot by plot. So this is how almost 95% of Lagos are constructed, just plot by plot. But this is they don't construct their own houses. So there is a plot owner, and maybe it's his or her house. But then immediately this owner constructs a house for 8 families, with 8 different kind of tracts. And then maybe later on he demolishes everything and constructs a huge, let's say a kind of a mansion, a huge mansion, even gated. So on that plot is almost everything possible. There is almost no rules that limit the use of your plot, and the plots are quite big. So a totally different type of urbanization. And to say the same, to say this is somehow informal, tells us nothing about the rules and the qualities of this piece of land. And here, I'm sorry, I don't have a better image. That's again Istanbul, but after 20 or 30 years, when these neighborhoods, these gecekondu neighborhoods, they were not fully self-built. They were, but the people commissioned some also informal laborers to build the house, and then they also somehow added to the house and changed the house. At a certain moment, these houses became quite comfortable. At the end, it became even a business, and they demolished the whole thing and constructed. There was then the legalization process going on, and then they constructed a new apartment house with maybe 8 apartments, and with a developer, and then maybe they got 2 apartments in the whole block, and the developer sold the rest. So a totally different process. And so we found here in both cases we have plotting. And popular urbanization, we said, has much more to do with, let's say, people's initiative. They have to organize, they have to work together, they have to also make political campaigns to legalize, to get electricity, to get all the urban services, everything that is necessary in a neighborhood. So a totally different process in popular urbanization. At the end, you could really say it is a process with a lot of positive aspects in the long run, not in the first 2 years or in the first 10 years even. But in the long run, it is a process of consolidation. And in the case of Lagos, it's also a process of consolidation, but it is already a market-driven process right from the beginning. No, it's a market relationship. So there's an owner of the plot, and then he has tenants. So okay. So something happened. Okay. now I show you how that looks on the map. In the case of Mexico City, what we see is so this kind of purple, dark purple. These are all neighborhoods that we call popular neighborhoods. So they are all self-built, more or less. So you see large parts of the entire city are self-built. And they stayed popular neighborhoods. And they consolidated, but they are still somehow the same owners, and they keep the houses, and they are usually not rented out. So it's a process of self-organization that is still visible and still dominant. Here in Istanbul, what happened was that all these gecekondu neighborhoods in again in purple, there are only some remnants of popular neighborhoods, and most of the others became a kind of a mixture or became what we call plotted neighborhoods. So they today are practically the same as, let's say, if you want to have an apartment, you find in those areas, you can rent an apartment here, with all the consequences that it has. And here is Lagos, and Lagos was always, of course, plotting urbanization, and there are some. You see these small dots. This is popular urbanization, and they are really in very precarious situations. Only where no clear landowner, so marshy land, or even land in the lagoon, or so they are very precarious settlements. So there, popular urbanization and precarity, this kind of link here, it is true, but these are only small territories. And by the way, the red are the centralities, so that you understand it. Well, another process that I could look at is bypass urbanism, and here we looked on the peripheries of the cities, and everybody thinks, oh yeah, the peripheries of the cities. So in Kolkata, there is the periphery in the east is marshy land. It's kind of really wetlands. And what we found in that periphery, so this is, of course, so Kolkata is one of the most densest area. I think it's the densest metropolis in the world. It's super dense. So that's the center of Kolkata. And what happened at the periphery here is this, kind of a massive new town development. And when we looked on the map, so that's our map, and you see here something, and if I go clear here, so if you just show that process, you see that something at the edge, suddenly something new develops. A city that is somehow bypassing the old town. The squalor, the troubles of Kolkata with all its messiness, all its, also all its qualities, of course, is somehow bypassed by a completely new city, which is a combination of several new towns. I can't go into the details, and a motorway. So that's the bypass that gave it the name. This is the eastern bypass of Kolkata. And along that bypass, you find suddenly new condo towers and new developments and hospitals and clinics and a lot of offices also. And suddenly a completely new city that is leaving behind the entire city of almost 20 million people. And that's also a shocking development. And the usually, this is at the edge somewhere. Yes, it's at the edge somewhere. But now, decisive functions, they move to this place. And the centrality of the old city is somehow in danger. And a similar process in Lagos, you know now, so that's plotting areas in Lagos, and that's I couldn't find a new picture. This is now in full speed. It's a development of a new town, Eco-Atlantic called, but the dimension is much bigger, and you only see it on the map. This is this orange thing. So that's Lagos, the usual Lagos, plotted areas. And then you have suddenly, and we see that better here, you have this thing. And this is like a new Lagos. It's like, even people from Lagos compare it like that. So there's a black town and a white town. And that's gated, fully gated. You have a gated bridge, you have a gated motorway, a toll motorway, a toll bridge. The whole thing is double gated. So and of course the tolls are so expensive that many people can't even afford to go to this area. And so a whole section of Lagos becomes a kind of westernized kind of for the wealthy middle classes of Lagos and for the expats in Lagos. So they have a safe place, and they have a place that, and here is the centrality of Lagos, the main centrality. So it has a direct access to this centrality. So privileged access, and the whole city of Lagos with also something like 18 million people is just, okay, yes, that's a mainland, that's the old city. We are not interested in that anymore. We leave it behind. It doesn't need any kind of infrastructure. It doesn't need support. Most of the infrastructure investment is concentrated in that area. And so here we call then that a kind of a bypass development, bypass urbanization. Mexico City, again, the popular urbanization, and here this is Santa Fe in the west. In the western part, a completely new centrality was constructed. That is planned, and it's of course built with private money. And it's a similar process, but Mexico is stronger, so you can't say that the rest of Mexico is left behind, but nevertheless, it's completely reorganizing the whole structure of Mexico towards the east, towards the wealthy area, and also here you have pole roads, pole tunnels, pole bridges, and a kind of a territory that is really made for the rich people, even with a private university, and many other kind of new uses here. So I'm coming, so that would be the new kind of figure. Now that's coming to the end. Just to show that we also looked on the other cities, of course. So that's Hong Kong, that's Tokyo, that's Paris, and that's Los Angeles, and we can discuss it maybe later. So this is a process this is also at the edge and of the metropolitan region, and we call that multi-layered patchwork urbanization, a kind of an almost undistinguishable patchwork of all different patches in these areas. And you see that almost the entire outskirts of Paris, the grande banlieue, is what we call patchwork urbanization. And then that would be another story. I think maybe I'll come back to that later. So that's Los Angeles. And what we found here is, here we mapped the centralities and found out that this famous Orange County, maybe you have read Edward Socha, and his kind of, his development, his description of this postmodern kind of new city. And that's a place that is, everybody thought this is the entirety of Los Angeles, but in fact it's just a part of it where you have new centralities. And I could tell you the entire story, but that would need some more time. Similar processes in Tokyo, and here also you find it in Hong Kong, and here also in Shenzhen. So, of course, now comes extended urbanization. And now we should do the same thing. So you're probably quite tired in the meantime, but this is another book we did, and here we looked on territories of extended urbanization. So what happens outside of this big metropolises, and that's the North Sea. So here we analyzed the North Sea as an urbanizing territory. And here we also developed a whole range of new terms and new concepts to understand what's going on in these endless places, in these battle zones between the urban and the old agricultural zones, and let's say also the rainforests and the deserts and all sorts of areas that also are on that planet, but are now in the grip of capitalization and of commodification. And of course, at the very end, and I'll just go back again, so extended urbanization, in 2 weeks' time, I will give another talk about that. So if you are interested in that, and also but what it means for instance, we can also discuss about Minas Gerais in that context. So we have another hour to discuss about, these developments. At the end, differential urbanization, and I think that's now my conclusion here. So what does it mean if we look on this very differentiated urban world? You see, it's not, so forget about models, forget about any kind of Chicago models or Los Angeles models or whatever. They don't work. They are always specific. So urban territories, and that was an experience we made already 20 years ago. Urbanizing territories are always specific because there are so many different influences that have imprints on these territories, that each urban territory is different. But of course, we can compare. We can find commonalities. We can find we can define urbanization processes. And then the most important thing: what shall we do with it? As Lefebvrians, of course, we have to, and that's a selection of terms. And we have to fight. And there are fights for centrality. There are fights for difference. There are processes of popular centralities. Famous example in Joburg, how centralities are somehow developed by the people, similar to popular neighborhoods. There are struggles in many ways for the appropriation of space, struggles for social reproduction, transforming various ways of transforming everyday life. I don't have to explain insurgent citizenship, Holsten. But we also found extended citizenship in Greece between very deserted, really deserted territories and the main city, the main urban area of Greece, Athens. There are solidarity networks. There are, of course, all sorts of commoning. There's also marcha. This is a term for commoning, an Arab term for commoning. It's an example from Palestine. Autogestion. Lefebvrians know that was Lefebvre's term. And my point here is, so what to do with all these kind of things? So there are so many different territories. There are so many different situations. All of them are confronted in one way or another with planetary processes, with planetary capitalism, I would say, with our planetary crisis. And with inequality and with, extreme differences and polarization in wealth. So all of them. And of course, there are regions that are in much worse situations than others. But the point here is to think about a planet, kind of a world of planetary urbanization means to connect these fights, to connect all these efforts to find different ways out of these often horrible situations and much more horrible futures that we see at the moment through the crises that are not ending. The climate crisis is not ending, is even not stopping. It goes on, it goes on, it goes on. And it affects every place. It also affects Switzerland, where the mountains are coming down and destroying villages and valleys. And you see it everywhere, and heat waves in all sorts of cities and. So here, to bring together these different kind of battles, these different efforts, and not to say, well, this is something special and we are for us, but to really be a kind of find ways. And there we have to go back to the 1970s. And I was a big fan of, at the time, of the dependencia theory, because it sought the world, and it sought the world in a, I would say, solidary way. So international solidarity was a key aspect and a key goal of those theories and of those discussions and of those battles. And I think that should still be the goal. So I end with another book. And that's definitely the last. And so, Possible Urban Worlds. At the end of the 20th century. This was one of our first books we did, collectively, International Network for Urban Research and Action. And in that book, we collected all sorts of possible urban worlds from our network and different ways how to handle and tackle these challenges and these often precarious situations. And I think so you can download that. It's if you go to Inura, just Inura, and then you can even download the book. We just restored it, put a new PDF file on our website, and it's still, I think, an idea how we should bring together these different fights and battles, and not to think about how we can distinguish each other from other fights, or to say others they make the wrong decisions, or these are not our friends, or these are not our comrades, or these are not our allies. A world of planetary crisis, a world of planetary urbanization needs collaboration, alliances, and a common battle. Thank you very much.